Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have our session coming up here about making sense of now. First, I just want to say thank you for giving us about an hour of your day today. I know you're extremely busy, not only closing out this school year, but also figuring out how you're going to move through the summer and then, of course, kick off next school year. And we know that as building leaders, there's a lot of unknowns, and we have to be prepared for a lot of uncertainty. But also be prepared to receive our students next school year. So I just want to welcome you. Thank you for giving us a little bit of your time. And before we move into introductions, I just want to let you know that this session will be recorded and you'll get a copy of this video following the presentation. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Michael Corey, and I'm one of the 3 consultants at the Educational Service Center of Northeast Ohio that will be facilitating today's session. And I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Pelfrey. Thank you again, like Michael mentioned, for taking the time out of your very hectic schedules right now with all the uncertainty and planning going into next year. So we appreciate you taking the time.
And I'm Kelly Stukas. I'll be the 3rd facilitator today, and we're glad to have you with us.
So to kick off our session here, we had a chat box question that was up and running, and that's one of the things you'll notice throughout the session today. It's only an hour, so this hour will go by fairly quickly. And to make sure that we have a little bit of participation, a little bit of two-way communication, we do have some chat box questions. We also have some polls that we'll be doing along the way to not only get feedback from you, but also to just demonstrate some of the ways that we can draw folks in when we're running virtual meetings, whether that's a staff meeting or an IEP meeting or whatever the case might be. So the chat box question talked about how have your communication styles changed? And we've noticed in the chat that there are several folks that are talking about, in some regards that they haven't. Some of us really find that our self-awareness is kind of shifted a little bit as far as our facial expressions or multitasking or the lure of doing something else while you're in a meeting or running a meeting. So we really have to be careful about how we come across that way. So it's interesting to see how the style that we communicate with maybe changes in some ways and doesn't in others. And sometimes it's just unnatural. It just feels weird just being apart from each other and just seeing talking heads. So one of the things we hope to address through this presentation is about how to make sense of now. This whole COVID, we'll explain the title as we go along. I just want to touch on just very quickly some of the Zoom norms. Perhaps you've been in some virtual sessions, maybe even running the Zoom, or maybe use Microsoft Teams or Google Hangout or whatever your system might be. These are some of the norms that we try to make use of here at the ESC when we run our sessions, but also some things for you to consider when you're working with your staff or other groups that you may be leading or participating in a meeting. So some of the features here in Zoom, you'll notice at the very bottom, you'll have a reactions button at the very bottom on the right-hand side, a little smiley face with a plus sign on it. That'll let you raise your hand or applaud. And you can also use when you can't hear, and typically it's in the beginning, you can put your hand up like this to let us know, or maybe you can have your participants, your staff use that with you so you know if you can be heard or not. We also have, in this scenario, we have 3 of us that are running the meeting. So one of us is always manning the controls while someone else is speaking. But that's certainly something to consider, that if you're running a meeting, you may want to have somebody who's watching the chat box or watching the participant window or whatever that the case might be, because it's very difficult to put your full energy into presenting when you're also trying to fly the airplane. So something to consider. Another couple Zoom norms that are pretty simple but pretty effective. The first one, of course, like you all right now, have your microphones muted. And by now, undoubtedly, you've noticed that background noise can play a pretty distracting role. So if you have a dog barking in the background, or if you have, I have a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, so at any moment they could come busting in here, and I pray that doesn't happen, but it's always a possibility, that background noise. So make sure you mute it. And also, whenever possible, you keep your video camera on or your webcam on. One of the advantages in these digital meetings is to be able to see each other's faces. And while we certainly lose a tremendous amount not being in person, the one advantage to video chatting is that we can at least see each other's face. We can read facial expressions, and as presenters or as the building leader and you're running a meeting, you can often look for those nonverbal cues, which can be pretty important. albeit stunted from an in-person meeting, can still be somewhat gleaned in a digital setting. So those are some of the norms that we'll be operating with during today's session. So one of the features that we try to draw folks in, and certainly something you can do with your staff, is to use polling. If you don't have a paid version of Zoom, that's fine. There's another polling website, Polls Everywhere. And that's something you can do as well. I'm going to launch this poll here, mostly because it prompted me to talk about polling, but it's also a way for us to make a little bit of a connection here. And the poll is pretty much, now that these stay-at-home orders are being lifted slowly, where do you see yourself most over the course of the summer? So this is certainly something that's been on a lot of our minds, and now that some of us find ourselves outside at restaurants or maybe they just need a haircut. I need a haircut badly. So, whatever those cases might be. We did this poll before, a little bit different of a one. It seems like nobody really cares about movie theaters, which I understand that. We're probably movied out, Netflixed out, whatever the case might be. So, all right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the poll here in 3, 2, 1. And so on my end, I was able to see kind of how many people responded, and then I'll turn around and share those results with you. So this is, of course, a strategy that can be pretty effective with your staff. It looks like most of us want to be outside somewhere. One of us is going to go camping. And then, 3 of us are just frankly, we're going to be in our office trying to figure out what in the world's going on. So I'm going to stop sharing those results. Just so that you know, on my end, those were anonymous, so we really can't see who answered what, and that was sort of a silly poll, but it was just to let you know that it was not really a record of who said what, just really looking at things in aggregate. And with that, we'll move on.
So today's the session outcomes for today are making sense of now, and what does that mean? Structures for virtual communication. We've been in a lot of different PD lately. We've been in a lot of meetings. I'm sure you have too. There are some structures out there that could help facilitate these virtual communications. And then structure for virtual meetings when you're running your staff meetings or you're talking with the community or parents or students, whatever it might be. We just want to, supply you with some strategies and some structures. So we're going to start off with making sense of now. And making sense of now really talks about sense making, or the ability to make decisions, which really boils down to judgment. And right now, making the right call is harder than ever. So as a building leader, you are routinely, continuously asked to make the right call and the right decisions daily, multiple decisions daily. So you're really relying on your sense making and your ability to make decisions, which then obviously is your ability to have judgment. Now, with that in mind, I want you to think about that there is a BC and an AC. So we had before COVID, which we're never going back to, and then we had after COVID. Now, COVID is still obviously with us, but what I mean by after COVID is that after COVID, things have changed. It's hit, it's with us. How are we going to respond? We have to acknowledge that there was a BC in a way we did things, and now there's an AC. And we have to continually remind ourselves to look through that lens on the AC side of things. So neither of these exist anymore, right? So management by walking around. I'm sure this is something you did routinely in your building, check in with your staff, do walkthroughs, hang out, in the office a little bit, talk to people in the cafeteria, in the hallway, during class changes. So these were all opportunities for you to check in with your staff, holding them accountable, doing some evaluating. You could really hold them accountable on your expectations, but ultimately, it was a way to communicate and was also a way to promote culture. So in addition to that, with not being able to manage by walking around, the chance encounters have now gone away. So even for you, staff members popping into your office to talk to you, or they have an idea about something, or they have a problem about something, that has gone away. What we have to acknowledge also is that it's gone away for our staff members as well. They're not meeting and talking about things in the lunch or break room anymore. They're not talking in the hallway. They're not talking on the way to the bathroom. So what's happening with these collisions going away, people are not sharing ideas as, seamlessly, if you would. They're not really problem solving in that very organic way. And they're not innovating or creating ideas unless there's some sort of formal structure to do so put forth by you or one of their team members. So what I like to think about this a little bit is that, you know, every problem is a puzzle and there's all these pieces. The thing we have to remember now with our staff members outside of the building, they hold pieces of the puzzle to solve the problem, but how are we going to get those puzzle pieces from them? How are we going to involve our staff members in helping us share the workload and share leadership? So we have to think about, you know, since these collisions aren't happening anymore, how are we going to set it up so they can happen? So, you know, the staff can help us. Another thing on the leadership side of this, something for you to think about as well, and something that, you know, you've probably encountered, and I know we've encountered, is that now the collisions are happening at home instead of with staff members, of people that get the contacts or APs or whatever it might be, or the, you know, if depending on what your role is, we are now sharing those collisions with people at home that have no context. So this can be a potential problem for us in our sense making and our decision making. So I put an example up here. You get off a call and you're upset, right? And a family member overhears you. And this happens, it happens in my house. And my wife wants to know what's going on and why I'm upset. And I start to explain to her a little bit, right? What is going on and what's happening, and maybe how I was talked to or how I was treated. And I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here to make my point. And in the call, you know, she heard something that somebody called me, you know, that was a stupid idea. What was I thinking? And I get off the phone and my wife was like, they can't talk to you that way. No one can talk to you that way. And immediately that starts to fill in my confirmation bias and going, you know what, they can't talk to me that way. All of a sudden, that person unintentionally, without context of what's going on, is starting to influence my decision making that may not know the entire story. So it's just something we need to be aware of when we're at home. This happens a lot with people that work from home or remotely as part of their regular job. This is something in education that we are now just starting to deal with. So when we think about our decisions and our sense making, this comes from Tim Kite's work, if you're familiar, the E plus R equals O, which there's an event, there's a response, and there's an outcome. So we have to think as the leader, what is the outcome my school is trying to achieve? And does every response I give serve that mission or that outcome? So we have to be very outcome oriented here. What is my team, either my leadership team or my BLT, what is their desired outcome? And is everything they're doing serving that mission? And then ultimately, as the leader, what am I doing? And what is my required role to make sure that we are all striving for the same outcome? And with your position as a building leader, it's also unique because you have a district, an administrative team, and then your own 20 square feet. So you have two different things running simultaneously that all should be aligned and connected as closely as possible in order to reach that outcome. So when you think about how to apply E plus R equals O, a couple of things that events are going to happen. 1,000 events happen a day in every scale, in personal life, professional life. We have a choice in our response to that event, which is going to equal an outcome. So we have to pay attention to what those events are. How do I need to respond? What outcome am I actually going after? And then we should have some sort of systematic way to do that. There's a lot more to this, but the one thing you don't want to get caught up in is an adult default response, where you're just responding out of default without really thinking something through. Because if you have a disciplined response and you really think it through, it could lead to your outcome. But perhaps with a default response where you're aggravated and it's just an emotional response, it could take you to a different outcome. So that's something else to consider as well.
So when we think about this disciplined response, it's so important right now, knowing that probably your staff is asking more questions than you can possibly answer right now, knowing that there's so many unknowns. Pressing pause is important because not only do we have to move from those technical fixes, we all flipped our classrooms, we all went online. We have a lot of really good technical components in place, but now we're moving to the more adaptive components. And knowing the adaptive work takes a little bit different type of thinking. We want to balance all the mediums too in which we're communicated with. We're always on. Our computer's always on. We're on a million Zoom calls a day. We have text. We have our phone going on. And there's a little time for us to press pause. There was a time when we used to drive away from our offices and we'd have reflective time in our car. On our way home, we'd have time to think about whatever has happened in the day. We'd have time to get our mind right. But now we cannot go home because we are home. So we need to be more intentional about pressing pause daily to find that focus and that disciplined response, knowing that some of the questions being asked of us right now, we might not have a response, and that is okay. Those items can go into the parking lot. So when we press pause, it helps us to avoid 4 main traps. These traps are fixating too much on an event. That can happen sometimes in the absence of communication, whether it be from our district offices or from other avenues. As Chris mentioned, gravitating to what's familiar, so we just have a response and we get it off our plate to move on. We might feel like giving up too soon when we don't have our reflection time, because the hurdles we're facing right now as administrators are large and hard, and no one has done this before. And not pressing pause or giving ourselves that time doesn't allow us time to reflect. And that thinking about something and reflecting are 2 different acts. Reflecting not only involves replaying a situation, but it requires the ability to analyze and make sense of a situation, to learn from it in order to have that disciplined response through an action plan. So one of the things we need to think about is how we physically schedule reflection time. It is through this reflection that we can provide ourselves with clarity, and we know that clarity is king. We know that the internal mindset can drive our external action. So when we think about getting our mind right, we want to focus on that inner response. We want to think about our internal scripts as an output from our virtual worlds because of technology barriers that exist. And so we offer you 2 protocols. The first protocol is the Sweet 16, and I mentioned it in another group I was facilitating, where you physically decide that you're going to end your workday. It is going to shut off. We cannot have administrators on computers at 1 a.m. cranking out emails. We have to have structure. So if we stop our workday at whatever time that is, at 5 p.m., we shut off our computer, we physically shut off our light and close our work door to our space at home. And for 16 minutes, we're going to go and focus on something other than work, whether it be playing with our kids, exercising, playing with our dog, cooking, whatever. For 16 minutes, it is uninterrupted time that is not focused on work. The other piece for reflection is sometimes we need to schedule it in. We need to physically put it on our Outlook calendar, or however you operate with your schedule for the day. Put it on your whiteboard. I am going to use this time to reflect, stop. What am I trying to accomplish for this school day? Where am I at with what I'm trying to accomplish? And what are my next steps?
So one of the themes I think you're going to notice as we kind of move throughout our presentation is that there's a lot of intentionality behind preparing for after COVID. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about over the next few minutes is our structures that we use for virtual communication. Kelly just talked about the intentionality in pressing pause and the intentionality of reflection. That's so important. But the intentionality behind preparing to communicate virtually. There's a lot of things that anytime you've sat in the building leader seat for even it's a short period of time, some of the skills and practices that you do slowly become almost second nature, automatic, and you don't necessarily think about them directly as much as you normally would, or maybe you would for the first time. Now that the game has changed somewhat, we need to be very intentional with how we approach our problems. So I'm going to throw up another poll here, speaking with the frequency with which you communicate with your staff. So, one of the things that Chris talked about those chance encounters are now gone. They've evaporated. You're no longer walking, the halls. You're not checking to make sure that the doors are all locked and happen to run into a staff member, or, in the lunchroom, or whatever those chance encounters, they seem to have evaporated. So now, again, with that intentionality theme, how often do you find yourself communicating with your staff members versus how often did you communicate that with them before? So now that we're in this new zone, how often do you find yourself reaching out? So I'm going to go ahead and shut down the polling here at 3, 2, 1. So we had 5 people respond. It looks like all but one of us is every day, and then the other person is 2 to 3 times per week. So of course, the frequency with which we communicate is incredibly important, because one of the things that we're going to talk about here in the next few minutes is going to be about how to harness the brain power behind your whole staff. So one of the things that you really need to give a little bit of thought to is how to unlock your staff's discretionary effort. Meaning, of all the effort that your staff is putting in, and I'm sure they're putting in quite a bit of effort, especially with trying to figure out how to connect with students and how to follow up and how to assess and all the things that go along with transitioning a classroom. How do you harness your staff's discretionary effort? Meaning, with all of the different ideas and all the different things that your staff is trying and all the different things that they're accomplishing, how can you as the building leader really put that together to move the whole building forward? And like Chris talked about, we're really focused on the outcomes. We want to identify and reduce behaviors that either don't have an impact or worse, they have a negative impact. And we want to refocus those efforts on behaviors that do. And part of that can come from how we structure our virtual communication. Virtual communication can be very challenging because we have a lot, and we'll talk about types of communication here in a moment, but it can be challenging because we're not all in the same place at the same time. But we want teachers to really start to think about having an owner versus a renter mindset. So you can imagine owning versus renting. The owner is going to be thinking about how are my actions going to affect something over the long term, whereas the renter may have a more short-term view on what their actions are. So you want your staff to think, okay, how are my actions now not only going to affect my classroom now, but how is this going to affect not only my classroom next school year, but also the whole school building? And so as the building leader, you really have to be intentional about how to get those communication channels open and how to continue to foster an owner mentality versus a renter mentality.
So when we're thinking about fostering this owner mentality, and we want to be thinking about how we're keeping our pulse on the building and what's really going on, we want to leverage our teacher action committees, or our BLTs. It's through these types of committees that we can build collective efficacy, where the group decides as a whole that what we do matters. Again, moving from that technical to the adaptive. Okay, we flipped the classrooms, now what? What does this mean for our lesson structure? What are the instructional frameworks that we're going to be operating on if we are continuing to work virtually? What are our non-negotiables so that all students are receiving a consistent experience even though we're in our new virtual worlds? Through our teacher action committees, we can also, as the principal, strategically share leadership. This is something that is intentional so that you are not owning every decision and every move, but as the collective group, you are strategically making decisions to move the building forward. When we think about how we communicate, things to consider, we think at 3,000 to 4,000 words per minute. We talk at 300 words per minute. We type at 60 words per minute. And the filter between typing and thinking is 50 times. So this causes us to reflect on how we communicate. We have a headline society. We know that it's very frightening, but most adults are getting their news from Facebook. We've all seen people comment on threads when they have not read the Facebook article. This gives us pause when we're thinking about our own communication, that it needs to be concise, clear, and with an intended outcome in mind, knowing that everybody is inundated in this virtual world. Other things to consider. Do you have Zoom gloom? Is Zoom leaving you unfulfilled? Well, Zoom fatigue is a real thing, and it stems from how we process information in our videos that many of you mentioned in the chats. On a video call, the only way to show we're paying attention is to look at the camera. But in real life, we do not stand within 3 feet of a colleague staring right into their face. That would probably be very weird and awkward. So having to engage in a constant gaze is uncomfortable and it's totally exhausting. In person, we're able to use our peripheral vision to glance out the window or to others in the room. We're able to read the room. But on a video call, because we're all sitting in different homes, if we turn to look out the window, it makes us look like we're not paying attention. And not to mention, as some of you have said before, we're looking at how we look, what our teeth look like. Is that bad lighting? Is that a wrinkle? So all of these visual breaks that are actually, we're not receiving visual breaks when we're on Zooms all the time, and our brain grows fatigued. So one of the suggestions we have for you is that we want participants to avoid the grid view and keep their cameras on the speaker view so they're able to attune to messaging and takeaways.
So, to Kelly, to carry on with what Kelly was talking about, it's particularly with the communicating virtually and looking, very closely, staring at the camera. You're very hyper aware of what your facial expressions are. One of the things that we should also be thinking about is how we are disciplined and how we communicate. So, for example, one of the things that we try to do is we try to limit the amount of time that we run a Zoom session for. Sitting for an hour and running a meeting can be a very exhausting experience, because you are constantly talking, you are constantly trying to fill the radio silence. But one of the things that I want to just remind you, and I'm sure you're aware of, is that discipline itself is completely neutral. Just because you are disciplined, it doesn't mean you're productive. So you can be disciplined and be driving the bus in the wrong direction. So what we need to do is we need to be intentional and be thoughtful about where is our discipline taking us. Because without discipline, we end up in a default mode. So our default communication, if there's one thing for sure, is that our default mode is simply not going to work in a digital or a blended format. Because of all the things that Kelly had mentioned, with all of the nonverbals and with all of the ways we communicate that are much more familiar to us, when we're in a digital environment and you use those default modes, it's simply not going to translate. And that's something that teachers have undoubtedly discovered when they're trying to teach a classroom, is that if they just try to translate their classroom right into a Zoom session, or they try to translate their whole classroom experience into a Google Classroom, it's going to fall flat, because a lot of what they have planned and a lot of what their experience depends upon really comes from being in a traditional classroom where they can see their students and they can interact, and there's that very familiar environment. And so when we talk about being disciplined, we want to make sure that not only are we disciplined, but that we're also driving in the right direction. But one thing's for certain is that you're not going to get where you want to go if you just rely on default communication. One of the things I want to just encourage you to think about a little bit, and undoubtedly I would almost guarantee that every single person on this session right now has experienced this to some degree, is that when you have organizational silence, one thing that has a tendency to happen is that there's communication that gets filled in on your behalf. So if you are not communicating with your teachers undoubtedly are filling that void with what their own communication happens to be. And so one of the things I just want to encourage you to think about is the idea of hold music. Now, as deplorable as hold music is, both in quality and sometimes quantity, one of the benefits of having hold music is that you've not been hung up on. And so while you're sitting there waiting for that customer service representative to get back with you, and you have the narrator who says that you are now second in line, one of the things that's important is that you know that you've not been hung up on. And so when we translate that into a building leader role, when we talk about communicating with our staff, sometimes it's important to communicate even when there's nothing to communicate. It lets our teachers know that you haven't forgot about them. You haven't forgot about what their needs or wants are. Sometimes it's a matter of just reminding them of things that you've already told them. But keeping the communication constant, even if there's nothing new to report, can be a very valuable exercise, because it keeps the staff in the loop. It keeps them aware that you haven't forgot about them. Because I would imagine that if you, with respect to central office or with respect to ODE or the legislature or the governor, when you aren't hearing things, you wonder what's going on. And then sometimes you begin to think about, I wonder this might be happening or this might be happening. And that can be a destructive force, especially if it's something that happens in your staff. It can be very counterproductive. So one of the things I want to encourage you to think about is keep that hold music going, that your staff doesn't begin to fill a void.
To complement keeping your hold music going is the structure in which we communicate. We know that in all settings, but it seems in particular to virtual, that we need to communicate frequently and often, right away. Quick matters. So our structures that we put in place for communication are important. How are students receiving communication? What's the frequency we communicate with teachers? How do parents receive communication? And how do they know where to get it and when to expect it? These structures not only matter with communication, but they matter as we're thinking about our blended situations for next school year. What are the structures that we are going to have in place so that our teachers know what's expected of their lesson organization, our parents know what's expected related to their role, and how these roles will be defined whether I'm at the schoolhouse or I'm moving virtually. Our structures will help us to be more agile as we transition between both situations. When we think about our structures for virtual communication, we bring to you a couple of ideas that can be adjusted, adapted, and some of you probably already have them in place. But consider a weekly team summary, especially if your teachers are working in grade level teams or departments, where they send a collective email together discussing with you or sharing with you challenges, questions, reminders, things that have been completed and things that they're working on in order to keep some consistency for how each grade level team or department operates, as well as consistency in the way they implement structures for their students and their families.
So along with that, another structure you could use for virtual communication is called On My Mind, or OMM. It provides a great entry point and gives the building leader the pulse of the staff and the school. So the idea is, and Kelly talks about this a lot, which I really like and agree with, is that anything you implement, you have to be able to manage. So we put up here 3 times per week. Please, this is just a suggestion. It could be 1 day a week, whatever works for you. But the point of this is you want to have your staff include 3 emotions and then in free form explain each one. So the reason for 3 that we put on here is because it really tips the scale in one way or the other. If they could be putting, an example, overwhelmed and happy, well, those are completely polar opposites. So what are they really feeling? So 3 is the tiebreaker for it. This is the way to honor and recognize how your staff is feeling during this really unpredictable time. It really helps with the culture, and it can enable a course correction. The other thing that this really does is it helps calibrate your expectations. So if you are putting out non-negotiables and expectations, and your staff is telling you in their feedback, on my mind, their emotions or how they're feeling, maybe it's too much, maybe it's not enough, maybe they want more, maybe they're looking for more structure from you, maybe they're looking for different expectations for you. With both of these virtual communication ideas, the thing that we're going to suggest that you do here is resist the urge to reply. So even on the weekly summary, so if they send you something, their questions, their suggestions, their problem areas, whatever that structure looks like for you, resist the urge to send something back, a confirmation email, for example, like, got it, thanks. All you're trying to do is allow them to share and vent. You acknowledge it by reading it, and then it also allows you what a lot of people in the business industry call them red arrows. So you can kind of see what the culture and the pulse of your staff and your building really is. And what it does too, it kind of alleviates the idea of micromanaging, to be honest, because the staff will be going, well, they're just trying to figure out everything I'm doing, and they just want me to, hold me accountable. If you're not saying got it, thanks, then it kind of takes that micromanagement out of the equation, because it's not about micromanaging. It's just about finding the pulse of the staff itself.
So one of the things we want to move on to now, we've talked about structured communication in general, but one of the key ways that we communicate with our staff is through meeting with them. And now this is true whether you're meeting for a whole staff meeting, you're going to talk to the whole building, or perhaps you're going to be talking with just a small group of teachers. Maybe it's a department, a grade level, or maybe it's your building leadership team, or whatever the case might be. We're going to talk a little bit about having a structure for our virtual meetings so that we can make them as productive as possible. So one of the things we want to throw out in the chat windows to have a little bit of discussion there, and I just want to mention that when we talk about having chat window conversations, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to have that whole conversation before we move on from the slide. I'm going to put up the question now, so that way the conversation can continue in the chat box while we continue to present our material for the remainder of our hour together. So now what I really want to get a little bit of input from the folks that are here is, what are some ways that you can maintain a sense of belonging for your students and staff in a distance learning environment. And one of the things that undoubtedly has happened is a sense of being dispersed, a sense of isolation. And we know that has very serious consequences, not only for our academic progress that we're making, but social, emotional. And that's true not only for students, but it's also true for staff. So what are some ways that maybe you have tried or that you're curious about trying to maintain a sense of belonging school culture, even when everyone seems to be pushed apart? So if you want to, feel free to respond to that in the chat. Maybe we can share some ideas with one another as we continue on with our content for you.
And then just let me know when people are responding if you want to jump in with comments.
Sure, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So communicating in the AC. So we talked about, right, that there's a BC, a before COVID, and an AC after COVID. And these two words, I don't know if they were so prevalent in our vocabulary before all this happened, but they definitely are now. So synchronous communication and asynchronous communication. To give you a little context and background, this came out of the IT or the information technology industry or environment because of all the remote work that they do. But now, obviously, with all the remote teaching and learning that we're doing, we are now borrowing these ideas. So synchronous communication, right, it happens in real time or as close to real time as possible, face-to-face, Zoom. Zoom gets really close to it, right? And that's about in Google Hangouts. As you can get to synchronous at the moment, asynchronous doesn't happen in real time. The participants can, send a response whenever they want, and that delay and that asynchronous can cause trouble for some of our staff members and for ourselves because we start running this internal script like Michael was talking about earlier. The other thing to think about this too as leaders, because some leaders are now putting expectations or non-negotiables on their staff about the amount of synchronous instruction they're using or the amount of asynchronous instruction they're using with their students. So that's just something to think about when you are communicating with your staff, students, and parents during this time. So now that, we used to use synchronous flow of information in the BC, but now we have to think about it differently. And Michael brought this up, this organizational silence is up 10 times now that we are in the AC after COVID. So what does that mean? The organizational silence. So if you had staff meetings before and there were difficulties or, that there were struggles to get people to participate, provide their input, just be involved in the group and moving, everything forward, your mission forward, that has now gotten even more difficult when we are in the AC, when we're in their virtual settings, because now people have a place to hide, right? They can sit in their little Zoom window and they hope that you don't call on them. We really can't do breakout rooms, or can we? Because we're going to show you some ideas of how we can hold our teachers accountable and really get them involved in some of the decision making to kind of help us move this work. So protocols, one way we can do this, protocols are great. We love protocols where we work. So, when you're thinking about it, start and end of the meeting are the most important. And then Kelly's going to talk about these a little bit more in detail, but it's really important to have the hand signals to obtain that synchronous communication during a meeting. Raising their hands, they can use the devices on Zoom, applause, thumbs up. You want to think about your tempo. We've been trying to replicate some of these ideas in this session. Tempo is really important as we are, getting zoomed out. So we want to make sure we have our outcome in mind, our plan, and then execute that plan. Because before in the BC, right, we could hold our staff all day and didn't think anything about it. But now we have to kind of step back and think about that again. Do we do them in 45, 60-minute sessions and then come back with breaks? Or how might we structure that differently so we can actually get the most out of them and the best thinking and the best problem solving? So you want to bake in these rituals is what we like to say too. So you start them off with it and then they just become part of the culture, baking those rituals in.
So we want to maximize participant time and we want to resist the urge of teachers to go and check their email or online shop or anything they can do to be distracted, because we all know on our Zoom platform that we can still be looking forward as we multitask. So having a meeting structure can help us with our tempo, and it can help us with our time management. We know that at the beginning of our COVID experience, we saw many people holding Zoom meetings to check in. So it was more of a free-flowing lack of structure. We're just checking in to see how you're doing. We saw it in classrooms where kids are holding up their pets. They're talking about Colby Jack, their cat. We saw it in our own staff meetings, and we're wondering about how are we going to create a structure so that we can be more productive when we get together and maximize that time. So we have stolen this graphic from the National Association of Elementary Principals. And here's a proposed meeting structure that you can have to keep that tempo going and help your staff resist the online shopping movement. Knowing that you would spend 5% of the meeting time defining the purpose, and that can be done through a pre-assignment. You have a warm-up period, which I wanted to mention. Rebecca said in the chat, during her warm-up period, she has everybody check in with how they're feeling, and that would fit right in that warm-up period. Then the bulk of your meeting is spent on the presentation component, but then you always get feedback because it's very hard to read your Zoom friends. So your feedback is critical so that you know that your content was received and what's the pulse in your building. And then finally, next steps. And the next steps is where you leave that 1 or 2 sentences where you want to make sure everybody took away the main focus of your meeting. The meeting format breakdown can also be adapted for lesson format. Those words can be switched around so that teachers can implement a structure within their Zoom calls that is purposeful with intent, as long as they're clear on what they're trying to accomplish. So in the purpose section, the 5%, to maximize this time, you might consider giving a pre-assignment. This is not an always thing. This is a sometimes thing, depending on what you're trying to do. Where you might provide an article, a graphic, or something that you want everyone to look at before they arrive in your meeting, so that when you get to your activity portion, you can strap back to the pre-reading assignment. The warm-up gets everyone involved, as Rebecca told us. This is the piece where we have to be disciplined, though, because it can be a runaway section of our meeting and it can become the main event, and this is not the main event. The purpose of the warm-up is to get everyone involved, to get everyone engaged quickly, again, to resist the online shopping urge or the check the email urge. We want you here. And some of the protocols that you can use is something called What's the Buzz, where you highlight worthy topics like life events. There hasn't been a shortage of educational news that could fit into this, district news, or other topics that you can think of. Again, get everyone engaged quick, but knowing this warm-up section cannot take over the meeting. It is a minor part, but an important part, because it's where we get everyone invested.
So when we look at this, the purpose drives the plan. We're back to that event plus response equals the outcome. And the plan drives the participants, agenda, and the length. So this frames our response and how we want to communicate. So when we're thinking about our virtual meetings, and you think back BC and your staff meetings or any meeting that you might have been having in district, one thing you can do to kind of get the results or the outcomes that you previously got is to use this, what they call a note catcher framework. So we have the link here. I'm going to open it in just a second. But this allows for the small group interaction with your staff members to work in a Google Doc, which I'm sure they've done before, but it provides you an access point to listen in to what's going on. And by listening, I mean watching what they're writing and what they're typing. You can provide feedback efficiently by inserting your comment right into the framework itself. And when a group is having trouble, the principal or the leader can insert themselves in that meeting, and they can really help facilitate them and get them going in the right direction so there's no wasted time. So what the note catcher looks like, and we'll have this in your participant folder, is just a really basic framework that you can make a copy of, if you wouldn't mind, and then share with your staff members for any staff meeting that you might be having virtually. So we just set it up. You could put your question, include the responses, record their notes, and so forth. And then each group would be doing this, and you as the administrator would, like I said, have an opportunity to, kind of just check in and listen in on what the groups are talking about and what their conversations are based on whatever the expectation was or the activity you had planned for them.
So one of the things you should also be thinking about is how you end your time together. Everything about virtual meetings should be intentional. You want to make sure that you're disciplined. And when you end your meetings, you should be thinking about How am I going to use the information that I learned from today and use that to move whatever my goals are forward? So one of the things you may want to consider doing is throwing out a very simple survey. We've given you 2 links here. You'll get this whole slide deck emailed to you following the presentation. And here are just 2 basic survey templates that you can use to send out after a virtual meeting and get some feedback from your staff. A couple of things to think about, though, is that anytime you ask or throw out a survey like this, of course, you want to make sure that it's anonymous. That's usually a good way to get some honest responses, but also think about sharing these results with your staff. Now that also means that you probably shouldn't ask questions that you don't want to have answered and you don't want to have shared. So you may want to say, how was my outfit today? And turn around and share that with the staff. So whenever you ask questions and you get those responses, you're going to want to share those. It helps with your transparency, but it also helps the staff to see where everyone is. And to go along with that, I want to throw out, we talked about harnessing our discretionary effort, harnessing the brain power that's existing within the building. And when I was in the building, I had some teachers that were real go-getters, and they would really innovate and do some things that were different. They would try things that were new and exciting. And so when we're in the situation like this, and we have staff members that maybe they're trying some really innovative things in a blended scenario that that your whole building would benefit from hearing. So that might be something you would throw in a survey, is say, what are you trying? What new things are what's working? What's not working? And then turn around and use those responses and have those staff members share out what they're trying and what they're doing. It's a good way for you to not only elicit responses from your staff, but it's also a way to share the leadership that's going on within your building. And if there's one thing that we know for sure going into next school year, is that no one person has all the answers, right? So if there's a way we can pull in and share leadership with some of the staff, that maybe they have a new activity that they've tried and it can be applied, if they're a science teacher and they can, the math teacher can use it. So if there's a way to pull that in, you can glean that information from surveys following your meetings. So also, when we want to end our meetings, we want to end on things that are new, exciting, things that are coming up. We want to make sure that we are disciplined in how we give that information out, that we don't belabor the point, that we don't talk too long, because again, we want, as Kelly mentioned, we want teachers to resist the online shopping, checking email, whatever the case might be, urges that they will have. But also, how you end the meeting, as you would end any lesson, or that you would expect your teachers to end their lesson, is you want them to be left with a message. So what is the message that you want them to take away from your particular meeting? What was it? Was it a meeting with a grade level? Was it a whole staff meeting? Whatever the group is, or whatever the topic was, you want to end your meeting on task, on point, with what those purposes are. And one of the things, and we'll do this today, you want to have a cool down portion. Now, sometimes, especially if you have a large Zoom meeting, you may not have the capacity to be interactive during the entire time, because sometimes that can swallow all of your usable time. So one of the things that you can try is saving questions for the end. So you come to a formal end in your meeting, and then you allow staff to leave if they don't have any questions, and then you have an open question and answer time where staff can stick around, ask questions, and interact with you in a two-way format. So that's something to think about. Also, when we're looking at our feedback portion, I'm not going to necessarily read that whole list to you, but there are some ideas as far as what that feedback can entail. Whether that is dealing with two-way communication within the staff meeting itself, maybe it's a follow-up afterwards. But one of the things that's certainly important is that you should be getting feedback from your staff. As I'm sure you would expect your teachers to be getting feedback from their students and families about what their experiences have been, you're going to want to do the same thing from a building leader standpoint. It helps you to improve your practice. It helps you to be aware of things that maybe you weren't aware of, especially in this new environment, and it's different and it's awkward sometimes. And the more we do it, the better. I'm sure you're better today than you were 2 months ago, but still, we want to make sure that we get that feedback. And then also, we want to make sure that we recognize our staff's accomplishments. One of the things that we find in this new form of communicating with each other is that we don't always have the ability to recognize each other's accomplishments. So as the building leader, it really falls upon you to highlight what are those staff accomplishments that are happening. What awesome things are going on around the building. And I say around the building, I don't necessarily mean around the physical building, because there's probably not a whole lot going on there as far as students are concerned. But what's going on educationally? what successes are we seeing? Because there's plenty of things that have us worried about what's going to be coming up over the summer and next school year, but there's not always that same vim and vigor that go around the successes. So we need to make sure we celebrate those, and those can oftentimes go not only at the end of your staff meeting, but also in pointed communications coming out from you regularly throughout the week. So one of the things that we want to leave you with, and we acknowledge fully, is that this can be very exhausting. The amount of energy that you put in is going to be in some ways more than it was before, because you have to channel all that energy into ways that maybe you're not used to. So when you're running a meeting, you need to make sure you keep a quick tempo. I don't know if you've been listening to the radio and there's silence on the radio, you think something's wrong, right? I mean, did the radio station burn down, or is my radio not working? Like, what's happening? And even with just a few seconds of silence. So when you're running a meeting in a digital way, you want to make sure that you keep the tempo quick, you keep people's attention, you don't belabor the point. Every section, if you have multiple people that you want to share, make sure that they know what they want to share ahead of time. I have plenty of experience in working with other people in my administrative days, where you turn the microphone over to someone, so to speak, and then they end up rambling for on and on. And they're good people and they're well-meaning people. They just don't necessarily know how to present, or they don't know exactly, okay, when's it time to wrap it up? So when you're preparing, make sure you have that laid out ahead of time. These are your points. Hearing from someone else is important, but you want to make sure that they stay on task and don't consume all the precious resource of time. And again, it's always worth considering to keep that feedback and the questions at the end. Now, if you're working in a small group of 3 or 4 or 5, that may be not necessary. But if you're working with a whole staff of 20, 30, 40, 70, 90, 100, I had a staff of 120, it's raising hands and answering questions during a staff meeting is not always going to be the most productive use of that time. So that's something to consider. Again, it's not carte blanche. It's going to happen every time that way, but something for you to think about. And finally, I just want to end with this last poll. It's always good feedback for us, and it's interesting to see how this changes over time. What is your comfort level with video conferencing? So I'm going to throw this out there, and when I say that, I don't necessarily mean Zoom. It could be Zoom, it could be Google Meet, Google Hangout, Microsoft Teams. It's interesting to see how this feedback changes over time, it's as far as the ESC, how we can help further make these sessions more productive and more informative. So I'm going to go ahead, and there's a few of us that are remaining, so I'm not going to let the poll run as long. And I'm going to go ahead and end our polling now and then share our results. So it looks like most of us are pretty comfortable with the format, even though we would all admit that there's still some things to learn. That's certainly true. There's certainly things that we are still learning as well. And when I first ran this poll, there was more folks that found themselves in the other categories where they were still learning a lot more. So it's good to see that we trial by fire, we sort of learn as we go. And that's something that is encouraging for us to see.
All right,
so with our, that pretty much concludes our time now, but as far as making sense of now, before and after COVID, I do want to highlight some sessions that we have coming up later this week. We have 3 sessions that are designed for building leaders each session will be run by each one of us as individuals. So Chris will be running the first session, Leadership Through Action, Behavior, and Skill. I'll be running a session on instructional coaching, and Kelly will be running a session on everyday courage. These sessions are free of charge. They're about an hour apiece. You can sign up on our website. We encourage you, if you have time in your schedule, to join us. Each one of those sessions will have an angle on digital blended learning, the new situation that we're in now. But hopefully we'll provide you some valuable insights as you begin to not only close out this school year, but also prepare for next school year.
All right, so as Michael mentioned earlier, one of the protocols or items that you might want to put in place is a cool down. So as opposed to just stopping this very quickly and abruptly, we want to have a cool down on our session as well. So we're going to stay on, and if anybody has any questions or wants to chat or just stick around for a minute, please feel free to do so. We're going to stay on the line as well. And here is our contact information. So you can connect with us. You can follow us on Twitter at ESC_curriculum. And I'd speak personally, and then I'll let them as well. But I really, thank you for taking the time out again of your very busy schedule. Wishing you nothing but the best for the remainder of the year, and as well as for going into the fall next year. So thanks again.
Yep. Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.